In the chilling silence of the Tower of London, a 19-year-old queen prepared for her demise, rehearsing the grim ritual of her own execution. Katherine Howard, once the vibrant new consort to Henry VIII, faced a fate decreed not merely by alleged indiscretion, but by the merciless machinations of a court where youth, beauty, and perceived innocence were fleeting assets, easily sacrificed. What heinous act could lead such a young woman to the block? Her story, tragically brief, is a stark indictment of Tudor power, revealing how a king's insatiable desires and paranoid grip transform personal lives into lethal political gambits. Katherine Howard's narrative is among the most somber chapters in Tudor history, laying bare the terrifying reality of existence under one of England's most despotic monarchs. Born into the influential Howard family around 1523, she was thrust into an environment where women were primarily instruments for male ambition, their very bodies and destinies deemed expendable in the relentless pursuit of power. Her brief tenure as Henry's fifth wife would culminate in accusations of treason, the torture of her associates, and ultimately her own execution on a cold February morning in 1542. This is more than a mere royal scandal. It is a profound insight into the brutal mechanics of Tudor justice, a system where confessions were agonizingly extracted, where the young and vulnerable were immolated to preserve the powerful, and where the king's mounting paranoia reshaped private relationships into capital offenses. Katherine Howard's final days starkly illustrate the devastating price of Henry VIII's reign of terror and the horrifying ease with which unchecked power could obliterate innocent lives. England in 1540 was a nation profoundly reshaped by religious turmoil and pervading political dread. Henry VIII, then approaching his late 40s, had already severed ties with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and dispatched 2 wives in his desperate quest for a male heir. The court had devolved into a treacherous labyrinth of rival factions, where survival hinged on navigating the king's increasingly volatile moods and suspicious paranoia. The Howards, one of England's oldest aristocratic lineages, identified an opportunity to reclaim their prominence by presenting their young kinswoman Catherine to the aging monarch. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's formidable chief minister, had recently overseen the king's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, and his adversaries sensed an opening. The Howard faction, spearheaded by the Duke of Norfolk, began subtly positioning Catherine as a potential successor to the unwelcome German princess. They shrewdly understood Henry's weakness for youthful, spirited women who could reignite his sense of virility, despite his increasingly corpulent physique and the putrid leg ulcers that made him a figure of repulsion rather than desire. The timing appeared impeccable for the Howard family's aspirations. Cromwell's influence was waning, and religious conservatives saw a chance to reverse the Protestant reforms sweeping across England. Catherine, with her striking beauty and Catholic connections, embodied hope for those yearning for a return to the traditional faith. What they fatally overlooked was the king's escalating instability and his readiness to annihilate anyone who dared to challenge his authority or wound his inflated pride. England in 1540 operated like a police state, where informants lurked everywhere, where private dialogues could swiftly become evidence of treason, and where the king's subjects lived in constant dread of the fateful knock at their door. The court itself had become a gilded cage, where courtiers exchanged smiles while secretly plotting each other's ruin, and where royal favor could morph into a death sentence overnight. Katherine Howard's upbringing was marked by a pattern of neglect and exploitation that would ultimately hasten her tragic end. Orphaned early in life upon her father's death, she was sent to reside in the household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess's residences at Chesworth House and later Horsham were ostensibly meant to provide young Catherine with the education and moral guidance appropriate for a nobleman's daughter. Instead, they became environments where she was exposed to adult relationships and sexual knowledge far beyond her tender years. The Dowager Duchess, an elderly woman more preoccupied with her own affairs than with diligently overseeing the young women in her charge, permitted Catherine to share a dormitory with older girls who introduced her to the perilous world of secret liaisons and clandestine encounters. It was in this setting that Catherine first acquired the skills that would later be weaponized against her: how to conduct covert relationships, how to compose love letters, and how to navigate the intricate landscape of sexual politics prevalent in aristocratic households. Her first significant relationship was with Henry Mannix, her music teacher, a man considerably older than the 13-year-old Katherine. This relationship, which likely involved sexual contact, established a recurring pattern that would haunt her throughout her brief existence. Mannix, keenly aware of the power he wielded over his youthful pupil, initiated her into physical intimacy while simultaneously instructing her in the art of deceiving her guardians about their meetings. When her relationship with Mannix concluded, Katherine swiftly became involved with Francis Derham, a gentleman pensioner within the Duchess's household. Their connection was far more profound, encompassing not only physical intimacy, but also pledges of marriage and the exchange of tokens. They addressed each other as husband and wife, and numerous witnesses later affirmed their belief that a binding betrothal had indeed occurred between them. The dormitory at Horsham transformed into a hub of hushed conversations and shared confidences, where young women learned to navigate the treacherous currents of desire and ambition. Katherine's roommates later testified to the casual attitude towards sexuality that permeated the household, where secret rendezvous were common, and the aging Duchess remained willfully oblivious to the activities unfolding under her roof. These formative relationships would later be used against Katherine, morphing from youthful indiscretions into damning evidence of her supposed immoral character. The very experiences that should have been safeguarded by responsible adults became the foundation for accusations of promiscuity and deceit that would ultimately cost her life. The inquiry that would dismantle Katherine Howard's life commenced not with her actions as queen, but with a forensic examination of her past that exposed the dereliction of her guardians and the inappropriate relationships that had marked her adolescence. This pattern of early sexual relationships, common for many young women of her social standing, but catastrophic when scrutinized through the prism of royal scandal, became the initial pillar of the case against her. By 1540, Katherine Howard had captured the attention of Henry VIII, but her ascent to becoming his fifth wife was built on the ruins of his prior marriages and the bodies of those who had defied him. The king's marital pattern had grown disturbingly predictable: initial infatuation, passionate courtship, swift marriage, followed by either death or annulment when his wives failed to produce the coveted male heir or when his interest waned. Katherine's rise coincided with a period when Henry was particularly susceptible to flattery and the illusion of rediscovered youth. His fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves had been a catastrophe from the moment he encountered his Flanders mare, as he cruelly dubbed her. The marriage had never been consummated, and Henry was desperate for an annulment that would liberate him to pursue more appealing prospects. The Howard family understood the king's psychology intimately. They had already provided him with one wife, Anne Boleyn, who had met her end on the executioner's block after failing to produce a male heir. Now they were prepared to risk another young woman from their family, gambling that Katherine's youth and beauty could succeed where Anne had failed. Katherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, meticulously orchestrated her introduction to court life. She was appointed a maid of honor to Anne of Cleves, placing her directly in the king's path at a time when he was most discontent with his current marriage. Her beauty, vivacity, and apparent innocence provided a stark contrast to the foreign queen he was so eager to divorce. The king's courtship of Katherine was both pathetic and terrifying, a desperate display by an aging tyrant striving to reclaim his youth through the conquest of a teenager. Henry, now grossly overweight, afflicted by painful leg ulcers, and prone to violent mood swings, lavished gifts upon the young woman who seemingly found him attractive despite his evident physical and emotional decline. Katherine, barely 17 and utterly unaware of the political forces manipulating her life, found herself the object of the most powerful man in England's obsessive attention. The Howard family tutored her on how to respond to the king's overtures, instructing her to be alluring, yet not overly forward, innocent, yet not naive, and always acutely aware of the ultimate objective, marriage and the resurgence of Howard power. The swiftness with which Henry transitioned from annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves to marrying Katherine Howard underscores the depth of his infatuation and his inability to reason when consumed by desire. Within weeks of his annulment being finalized, Katherine found herself Queen of England, a position that brought not only unimaginable privilege but also extraordinary peril. Katherine's wedding to Henry VIII took place in July 1540, mere weeks after his marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled. The ceremony, a mix of celebration and silent foreboding, saw a 19-year-old bride marrying a man nearly 30 years her senior, whose previous wives had faced fates ranging from annulment to execution. The Howard family reveled in their restored influence, while Katherine herself seemed to grasp little of the ominous historical precedent she was unknowingly following. The initial months of Katherine's queenship appeared prosperous. Henry, revitalized by his young wife's apparent affection, seemed happier than he had been in years. He showered her with gifts, including jewels that had once adorned his previous wives, a macabre recycling of royal treasures that underscored his callous disregard for the women he had discarded. Katherine embraced her royal role with youthful exuberance, reveling in the ceremonies, the magnificent attire, and the authority that accompanied her position. She interceded on behalf of prisoners, even those condemned for religious reasons, displaying a compassionate nature that initially endeared her to many at court. However, the very qualities that had drawn Henry to Katherine also rendered her susceptible to the perilous currents of court life. Her youth and inexperience made her an effortless target for those seeking to manipulate her for their own ends, while her inherent warmth and friendliness were misconstrued as flirtation by men who perceived an opportunity in her seeming accessibility. The king's health during this period was rapidly declining, rendering him increasingly irritable and suspicious. His leg ulcers had become so severely infected that their stench was noticeable to everyone around him, and his weight had swelled to the point where he required mechanical aid to mount his horse. These physical ailments exacerbated violent mood swings that made him unpredictable and dangerous. Katherine's inability to conceive quickly became a profound source of anxiety for both her and her family. Henry's desperate need for a male heir had already cost 2 wives their lives, and the pressure on Katherine to conceive was immense. The failure to swiftly produce an heir created an atmosphere of pervasive tension, making every aspect of her conduct subject to intense scrutiny and suspicion. The Queen's household, like all royal establishments, was rife with spies and informants who meticulously reported every conversation and interaction to various political factions. Katherine's every utterance was dissected for signs of disloyalty or improper behavior, while her private moments were intruded upon by servants whose primary allegiance was not to her, but to those who paid for intelligence about her activities. The fatal attraction that would ultimately undo Katherine Howard materialized in the form of Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. His proximity to power and undeniable charm proved irresistible to a young woman ensnared in a marriage to an increasingly repulsive husband. Culpeper, roughly Katherine's age and possessing the vitality and allure that Henry had long since lost, embodied everything absent from her marriage to the king. Their relationship began innocently enough, with casual conversations and stolen glances that gradually escalated into something far more perilous. Culpeper leveraged his regular access to the royal apartments, granted by his position in the king's household, to pursue a relationship with the queen that both knew could prove lethal. The secret encounters between Katherine and Culpeper were facilitated by Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who, having survived the destruction of the Boleyn family, now found herself entangled in another queen's downfall. Jane, the widow of George Boleyn, who had been executed alongside Anne Boleyn, should have understood better than anyone the perils of royal scandal, yet she willingly acted as the intermediary for the clandestine romance. Katherine's letters to Culpeper, penned in her own hand, would later become critical evidence in her trial. These documents revealed not just romantic sentiments, but also a level of intimacy that could be construed as treasonous. Her written words, "It makes my heart to die to think what fortune I have, that I cannot be always in your company," would be used to portray her as an adulteress who had betrayed both her marriage vows and her allegiance to the crown. The meetings themselves occurred in various locations, from the Queen's private chambers to secluded spots during royal progresses. The participants went to elaborate lengths to conceal their activities, employing coded messages and trusted intermediaries to arrange their rendezvous. These precautions, while essential for their safety, also provided evidence of premeditation that would later be used against them. Culpeper's motivations in pursuing the relationship remain ambiguous, whether driven by genuine infatuation with the Queen, a desire for political advancement, or simply the thrill of the forbidden liaison. His actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for the dire consequences awaiting anyone who dared to cuckold the King of England. The relationship deepened over several months, marked by increasing boldness and diminishing caution. What began as stolen glances and brief conversations escalated into lengthy private meetings and passionate correspondence. Both Katherine and Culpeper appeared to lose sight of the mortal danger they faced, consumed by the intensity of their emotions and the exhilaration of their secret romance. The net began to tighten around Katherine Howard in October 1541, when her past finally resurfaced with devastating consequences. The revelation of her prior relationships and current affair came not through meticulous investigation, but through the desperate actions of John Lascelles, a reformer who saw an opportunity to undermine the Catholic Howard faction by exposing the Queen's secrets. Lascelles approached Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury and a prominent Protestant leader, with information regarding Catherine's past relationships. His sister, Mary Hall, had been a servant in the Dowager Duchess's household and had witnessed Catherine's relationships with both Henry Manox and Francis Derham. The timing of this disclosure was particularly damaging, arriving just as Henry was celebrating what he believed to be his blissful marriage. Cranmer faced a terrible predicament. He knew that presenting such accusations to the king could result in another royal execution, but he also understood that failing to report potential treason could cost him his own life. After much deliberation, he chose to present the information to Henry in a letter, allowing the king to read the accusations privately rather than hearing them spoken aloud. Henry's initial reaction to the revelations was one of disbelief and furious indignation. He refused to accept that his young wife, who seemed to adore him, could have deceived him so completely. His first impulse was to punish the messenger, but as more incriminating evidence emerged, his disbelief morphed into the chilling fury that had characterized his previous dealings with unfaithful wives. The subsequent investigation was conducted with the same methodical brutality that had defined Henry's prior marital scandals. Francis Derham and Henry Manox were arrested and subjected to torture, their confessions extracted through the application of the rack and other instruments of agony. Their testimony provided detailed accounts of their relationships with Katherine, painting her as a willing participant in sexual relationships that commenced when she was barely a teenager. Thomas Culpeper's arrest swiftly followed, and his interrogation unveiled the extent of his relationship with the Queen. Under torture, he admitted to meeting with Katherine privately, but denied that their relationship had been consummated. Whether his confession was truthful or merely an attempt to minimize his culpability under extreme duress remains uncertain. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was also apprehended for her role in facilitating the meetings between Katherine and Culpeper. Her interrogation revealed the elaborate precautions taken to conceal the relationship and the extent to which she had served as an intermediary between the lovers. Her testimony would prove pivotal in establishing the premeditated nature of the alleged adultery. Katherine Howard's final imprisonment began on November 14, 1541, when she was confined to her apartments as the investigation into her conduct persisted. The young queen, who just months prior had been the focal point of court festivities and royal favor, found herself utterly isolated, attended only by a small number of carefully chosen servants. The conditions of her confinement were meticulously designed to break her spirit and coerce a full confession. She was denied access to writing materials, prevented from communicating with anyone outside her immediate household, and subjected to relentless interrogation by the king's commissioners. The psychological pressure was as calculated and deliberate as any physical torture. Katherine's emotional state rapidly deteriorated during this period. Witnesses reported that she oscillated between bouts of hysteria and catatonic silence, unable to grasp the utter collapse of her world. The young woman who had once commanded the resources of an entire kingdom was now powerless to influence even the smallest aspects of her daily routine. The interrogations focused not only on her recent relationship with Culpeper, but also on her past relationships and her failure to disclose them before her marriage to the king. The commissioners were particularly keen on establishing whether she had entered into a binding betrothal with Francis Derham, which would have rendered her subsequent marriage to Henry invalid and potentially treasonous. Catherine's responses to questioning were inconsistent and frequently contradictory, reflecting both her emotional distress and her genuine confusion regarding the legal implications of her past relationships. Her youth and lack of education made her especially vulnerable to the sophisticated legal arguments being constructed against her, and she struggled to comprehend how actions she had considered private matters could be transformed into evidence of treason. The Queen's physical health also began to decline under the strain of her confinement. She rapidly lost weight, suffered from insomnia, and developed a nervous tremor that caused her hands to shake uncontrollably. These physical symptoms were meticulously documented by her guards, as even her bodily responses to stress were considered potential evidence of her guilt. As the investigation advanced, it became clear that Catherine's fate was already sealed. The king's previous pattern with unfaithful wives left little doubt about the outcome, and the only remaining question was whether she would be granted the mercy of a private execution or subjected to the public spectacle of being burned at the stake as a traitor. The legal machinery designed to destroy Katherine Howard was set in motion with the same ruthless efficiency that had characterized Henry VIII's previous matrimonial scandals. Parliament was convened to pass a bill of attainder against the Queen legislative process that would condemn her without the need for a formal trial where she might have presented a defense. The Bill of Attainder represented a blatant corruption of English legal tradition, allowing the king to circumvent normal judicial procedures when dealing with cases that touched upon royal prerogative. Catherine would be condemned not by a jury of her peers, but by a parliament that existed entirely at the king's whim and dared not oppose his will. The charges against Catherine were meticulously crafted to ensure her destruction, while avoiding any admission that the king himself had been deceived or had erred in judgment. She was accused of concealing her previous relationships before marriage, engaging in adultery with Thomas Culpeper, and conspiring to imagine the king's death through her treasonous conduct. The evidence presented against her included the testimony of her former lovers, extracted under torture, her own letters to Culpeper, and the testimony of servants who had witnessed or facilitated her secret meetings. This evidence was presented as proof of a deliberate conspiracy to deceive the king and betray the crown. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham faced their own trials and condemnations, with both men ultimately sentenced to the traditional traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Culpeper, perhaps due to his higher social status or the king's lingering affection for him, was granted the mercy of a simple beheading, while Derham endured the full brutality of the traitor's execution. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, posed a unique legal challenge because she appeared to have suffered a complete mental breakdown during her imprisonment, and English law traditionally held that insane persons could not be executed. Parliament resolved this inconvenience by passing a special statute declaring that madness was no defense against treason, clearing the path for her execution. The Bill of Attainder against Catherine passed both houses of Parliament without significant opposition, as no member dared to speak in defense of a queen whom the king had already condemned. The swiftness and unanimity of the parliamentary process demonstrated the complete subservience of England's legislative body to Henry's tyrannical will. Katherine Howard's final days in the Tower of London revealed both the cruelty of Tudor justice and the remarkable courage of a young woman facing certain death. Transferred to the Tower on February 10, 1542, she was confined in the very rooms that had held Anne Boleyn 6 years earlier, a deliberate psychological torment that underscored the fate awaiting unfaithful queens. The Tower's lieutenant, Sir John Gage, was instructed to treat Catherine with the respect due to her royal status, while ensuring that she could not escape or harm herself before her execution. This delicate balance between courtesy and security created an atmosphere of surreal politeness surrounding the preparation for judicial murder. Catherine's behavior during her final days astonished many who had known her only as a frivolous young woman primarily interested in attire and court festivities. Confronted with the certainty of death, she displayed a dignity and composure that impressed even her guards. She dedicated her time to prayer, reading religious texts, and spiritually preparing herself for the end that awaited her. The young queen's most poignant request during this period was for the executioner's block to be brought to her room so that she could practice positioning her head upon it correctly. This macabre rehearsal was driven by her desire to die with dignity, rather than the hysteria that had characterized some previous royal executions. She reportedly spent hours perfecting the alignment that would allow the headsman to perform his grim task efficiently. Catherine's final letters, dictated to her attendants since she was denied writing materials, expressed genuine remorse for her actions while maintaining her innocence of the most serious charges against her. She acknowledged her failure to disclose her past relationships before marriage, but denied that she had committed adultery as queen or conspired against the king's life. The condemned queen also utilized her final days to make provisions for her servants, requesting that they be cared for after her death and expressing gratitude for their loyal service during her imprisonment. This concern for others in the face of her own approaching doom revealed a maturity and selflessness that had not been fully evident during her brief reign. On the evening of February 12, 1542, Catherine was informed that her execution would take place the following morning. She spent her final night in prayer and meditation, declining offers of food but accepting the spiritual comfort provided by the priests who attended her. Her composure during these final hours would be remembered as the most admirable aspect of her short and tragic life. The execution of Katherine Howard on February 13, 1542, was conducted with the same grim efficiency that had characterized Henry VIII's previous judicial murders. Yet it also revealed the extraordinary courage of a 19-year-old girl facing death with remarkable composure. The execution was scheduled for dawn to minimize the number of witnesses and reduce the potential for public sympathy for the condemned queen. Catherine was led to the scaffold within the tower's walls, the very location where Anne Boleyn had met her fate 6 years earlier. The executioner was an expert imported from France, selected for his skill in ensuring a swift and clean death, rather than the botched beheadings that sometimes resulted from using inexperienced headsmen. The small gathering of witnesses included tower officials, representatives of the king, and a few courtiers whose presence was mandated by protocol. Catherine's own servants were permitted to attend, and their subsequent accounts provided the most detailed descriptions of her final moments. Dressed in a black velvet gown and white coif, Catherine approached the scaffold with steady steps and no discernible signs of fear. Her practiced positioning on the block evinced the meticulous care she had taken to prepare for this moment, and her composure impressed even those who had come to witness her disgrace rather than her courage. Catherine's final speech was concise and adhered to the traditional formula expected of royal executions. She acknowledged her offenses against the king, requested prayers for her soul, and forgave those who had orchestrated her destruction. She made no attempt to proclaim her innocence or appeal for mercy, understanding that such gestures would be futile and might only prolong her suffering. The execution itself was completed with a single stroke, the French executioner demonstrating the skill for which he had been chosen. Katherine Howard died instantly, her suffering concluded after months of imprisonment, interrogation, and psychological torment. She was interred immediately in an unmarked grave within the tower's chapel, joining Anne Boleyn and others who had fallen victim to Henry's matrimonial paranoia. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was executed shortly after Catherine, her own death completing the eradication of all the principal figures in the scandal. Her execution, occurring despite her apparent madness, underscored the lengths to which Henry would go to eliminate anyone connected to his wife's alleged betrayal. Katherine Howard's death signaled the end of the Howard family's brief resurgence to power and influence. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was himself later condemned to death for treason, though he was spared only by Henry's own death on the eve of his scheduled execution. The family's repeated entanglement in royal scandals had finally exhausted even Henry's tolerance for their ambitions. The brutal efficiency of Catherine's execution and the methodical destruction of everyone connected to her alleged crimes revealed the true nature of Henry VIII's reign. This was not justice, but the arbitrary exercise of absolute power, where the king's wounded pride was sufficient justification for the judicial murder of a teenager whose greatest crime may have been falling in love with someone her own age. The aftermath of Katherine Howard's execution resonated throughout English society, serving as a stark reminder of the perils facing anyone who dared to defy Henry VIII or become ensnared in the treacherous world of royal marriage. The swiftness and thoroughness with which the king had eliminated his fifth wife sent an unambiguous message to his subjects about the consequences of real or perceived betrayal. Parliament, having dutifully passed the Bill of Attainder that condemned Catherine without trial, quickly moved to address the legal ramifications of the king's latest matrimonial disaster. New laws were enacted, making it treasonous for any woman to marry the king without first disclosing her complete sexual history, a statute that betrayed the paranoia and insecurity underlying Henry's relationships with women. The religious implications of Catherine's fall were equally significant. Her Catholic relatives had hoped that her influence would lead to a restoration of traditional religious practices, but her disgrace and execution instead bolstered the position of Protestant reformers who had orchestrated her downfall. The Howard family's humiliation became a victory for those who supported England's break with Rome. Henry's reaction to Catherine's execution was characteristically callous and self-serving. Rather than expressing any remorse for the death of his teenage wife, he placed full blame on her for deceiving him and portrayed himself as the victim of feminine wiles and Catholic conspiracy. His ability to cast himself as the injured party while ordering the judicial murder of a 19-year-old girl demonstrated the complete absence of moral accountability that defined his reign. The king's subsequent search for a sixth wife was influenced by the lessons learned from Catherine's case. His eventual marriage to Catherine Parr was preceded by exhaustive investigations into her background and character, and she was chosen partly because her maturity and Protestant convictions made her less likely to engage in the kind of romantic adventures that had doomed her predecessors. The broader impact on English society was profound, as Catherine's fate reinforced the absolute nature of royal authority and the powerlessness of even the highest-ranking subjects when they fell from favor. The aristocracy understood that neither noble birth nor royal marriage offered any protection against the king's wrath, fostering an atmosphere of fear and subservience that would characterize the remainder of Henry's reign. The historical legacy of Katherine Howard's execution continues to evolve as scholars reassess her story and its implications. Modern historians have increasingly challenged the traditional narrative that depicted her as a promiscuous adulteress who brought about her own destruction through immoral behavior and poor judgment. Contemporary feminist scholarship has reframed Catherine's story as that of a victim of systematic abuse and exploitation, beginning with her inappropriate sexual relationships as a young teenager and culminating in her judicial murder at the hands of a tyrannical husband. This interpretation emphasizes the power imbalances that shaped her life and the impossibility of meaningful consent in her relationships with older, more powerful men. The question of Catherine's actual guilt remains contentious among historians. While her past relationships before marriage are well documented, the evidence for adultery with Thomas Culpeper is less conclusive. Her letters to him, though intimate in tone, do not explicitly admit to physical adultery, and Culpeper's own confession under torture may have been intended to minimize his crimes rather than provide accurate testimony. The legal procedures used to condemn Catherine have been universally criticized by modern scholars as a perversion of justice that denied her basic rights to defense and due process. The use of parliamentary attainder instead of a judicial trial, the acceptance of testimony extracted under torture, and the creation of new laws specifically designed to ensure her conviction all demonstrate the arbitrary nature of Tudor justice when it served royal purposes. Catherine's story has also been re-examined through the lens of child sexual abuse, with many historians now acknowledging that her early relationships with Henry Manox and Francis Derham constituted statutory rape by modern standards. Her subsequent behavior as queen can thus be understood not as evidence of inherent promiscuity, but as the predictable outcome of childhood trauma and exploitation. The broader ramifications of Katherine Howard's fate extend beyond her individual tragedy to illuminate the systematic oppression of women in Tudor society. Her story reveals how women's bodies and sexuality were treated as political commodities, subjected to constant surveillance and control by male relatives, husbands, and the state itself. The enduring fascination with Katherine Howard's story reflects both its intrinsic drama and its continuing relevance to contemporary discussions about power, consent, and justice. Her brief life and violent death serve as a window into a world where youth and beauty could elevate a woman to the highest position in the land, only to become the instruments of her destruction when they failed to serve male ambitions and desires. Katherine Howard's story stands as one of history's most tragic examples of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how the innocent can be destroyed by forces beyond their understanding or control. Her fate reminds us that behind every historical statistic lies a human being whose suffering deserves to be remembered and understood, not merely as entertainment, but as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the vulnerability of those who lack power in societies that view them as expendable. And so, the haunting tale of Katherine Howard comes to a close, a powerful reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and names, but a tapestry woven with human stories of triumph and, often, immense tragedy. Her life, brief and brutally cut short, serves as a poignant testament to the terrifying realities of unchecked power, the vulnerability of the innocent, and the enduring struggle for justice. It forces us to look beyond the glittering facade of royalty and confront the profound human cost of ambition and tyranny. What are your thoughts on Katherine Howard's story? Did anything surprise you, or perhaps change your perspective on this period of history? We'd love to hear your insights, questions, or any further discussion points in the comments section below. Your engagement truly enriches our community. If you found this deep dive into Tudor history compelling, please consider hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications. By joining our channel, you won't miss out on future explorations of fascinating historical figures and pivotal moments that continue to shape our understanding of the past. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.